When we open the Gospel of John, we meet a mysterious figure, the disciple whom Jesus loved. He appears at the Last Supper. He stands at the cross. He outruns Peter to the tomb. And at the end of the Gospel, we are told, this is the disciple who testifies to these things. And we know that his testimony is true. John chapter 21 and verse 24. So for 2,000 years or so, Christians have asked, well, who was this person? Was it John, the son of Zebedee? Was it Lazarus? Or was it someone else entirely? Perhaps someone very close to Jesus, someone who became the leader of the Jerusalem congregation or church. Today, we are going to explore the growing theory that this beloved disciple may have been James, the brother of Jesus, and how the gospel itself shows signs of really multiple hands and layers of theology far removed from the earliest movement Jesus founded. So let's take this slowly. Let's take it carefully and respectfully, because this touches the very foundations of Christian tradition. See, if the gospel claims eyewitness testimony, then knowing which eyewitness really does matter, doesn't it? See, was it a Galilean fisherman, John, son of Zebedee, a man raised from the dead, Lazarus, or the brother of Jesus who became the head of his movement? The beloved disciple, well, is just a side character. He is, in fact, the anchor the gospel leans on, really, for its own credibility. So understanding who he was, really helps us to understand why John's gospel sounds so different from early Christian theology that diverged. And what were the earliest followers of Jesus? What did they actually believe? See, this is not about challenging faith. It's about tracing the history faithfully. Three main characters. John, son of Zebedee. That's the traditional view. This is the view most people have heard in the congregation, in the churches, and at meetings. So, what are the strengths of this particular view? Well, ancient tradition from the 2nd century onward. Early church fathers repeat the claim. So, what about any weaknesses? Weaknesses surface when we begin looking closely at the contents of this gospel. John is never named in the gospel. The sons of Zebedee appear only once, and that is in the final chapter, chapter 21. And most scholars view that chapter as an addition. We'll come to that later. See, this beloved disciple acts like a Jerusalem insider, not a Galilean fisherman. And most modern scholars, even conservative ones, now consider this view really unlikely. So what about Lazarus? Well, some have argued for Lazarus because the text says in John chapter 11 and those first 3 verses, at this time a man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary, whose brother Lazarus was sick, was to anoint the Lord with perfume and wipe his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. And after Jesus raises him, the beloved disciple appears more frequently. But again, the problems with this view are really significant. See, Lazarus is never at the Last Supper. He's never at the cross or the execution site, never at the tomb, never described even as a disciple, never mentioned again after chapter 12 of this gospel. See, this theory has emotional appeal, but the textual support is very weak. Then we have James the Just. This is the position of James Tabor and others. This is the theory that's really gaining attention today. And why? Well, let's think about it. James, the brother of Jesus, became the leader of the Jerusalem congregational church. It wasn't John, it wasn't Peter. And Paul himself writes at Galatians 1 and verse 19, I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. And early Christian historian Hegesippus, he reports, says James was universally called the Just. He was revered, he was respected and beloved. So the theory proposes that the beloved disciple was in fact James, and his testimony was preserved. But then later writers shaped it into the Gospel of John. See, the prologue and Greek metaphysics were not from James, but added by the community, the Johannine community. So we are now going to explore this in some depth. What is the most powerful clue in favor of James? Jesus entrusts Mary, his mother, to this beloved disciple. See, at the cross or the site of execution, John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27, Jesus says, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, here is your son. Then he said to the disciple, here is your mother. So from that hour, this disciple took her into his home. Now, why would Jesus give his mother to someone outside the family and not to his own brothers? See, in first century Judaism, that really would be unthinkable. But if the beloved disciple was James, his brother, then the scene, well, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It's Occam's razor again. All things being equal, the simplest explanation is the right one. Then there is the gospel silence about Jesus' brothers. The synoptics repeatedly mention Jesus' brothers: James, Joseph, Simon, Judas. John's gospel mentions them once and then quite, dismissively. In John chapter 7 and verse 5, we read, not even his brothers believed in him. And after that, nothing. And no mention at the cross. No mention at the resurrection. Not even in chapter 21. See, this silence, it is strange, isn't it? See, unless the beloved disciple was in fact one of them, concealed behind a title. Then we have James's central leadership after the resurrection. he becomes the head of the Jerusalem congregation. Acts chapter 12, chapter 15, and chapter 21. He is, in fact, the final authority, even Peter and Paul, over them. He is the one everyone must report to. The only leader called righteous and holy by early sources. Does this sound like someone who only believed after the resurrection? It sounds like someone deeply connected to Jesus from the beginning. All right. How did the early Christian texts, how did they describe James? Well, non-canonical texts like the Gospel of Hebrews or the Gospel of Thomas, the Nag Hammadi writings, they portray James as the brother, the heir, the beloved, and the one Jesus revealed himself to after the resurrection, the one who will lead. See, do not these texts echo a beloved disciple role? Then we have the realism, really, of geography. Just think about this. This beloved disciple seems to live in or near Jerusalem. He is seated next to Jesus at the Last Supper. He is present at the trial, at the cross, at the execution site. He is there at the tomb. He is known to the high priest. John chapter 18, 15 and 16. Now Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he also went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Peter stood outside the door. Then the disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter into the courtyard. See, are we getting a picture here? See, all the available evidence suggests James lived in Jerusalem. Some traditions suggest he was, in fact, a priest, or at least connected to the temple. This explains John chapter 18 and verses 15 and 16, which we've just read. Eusebius, the early church historian, mentions James as the first bishop of Jerusalem. Historian Josephus mentions his martyrdom where? In Jerusalem. See, all of this fits perfectly. So the question then is, who wrote the Gospel of John? Was it James? Well, what is the case against James as the author of the Gospel? Here, really, is where observation is extremely important. Indeed, it's absolutely crucial. So let's just consider this. The prologue is not from James. It's not Jamesian, if you like. John chapter 1 and verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. See, this is Greek philosophical logos wisdom theology, not something the early Jerusalem movement would have produced. See, James was rooted in the Torah. He was rooted in wisdom literature, the Ketuvim, the writings known as, this is the section of the Hebrew Bible, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. The practical obedience contained in them, the teachings of Jesus. Nothing in those first 18 verses reflects James's worldview. No. So the conclusion has to be that James's testimony may lie behind the gospel, but he did not write the gospel. The theology of the gospel resembles a later Greek-influenced community. Scholars like Raymond Brown and J. Lewis Martin and others argue the Gospel of John went through several stages. See, an early eyewitness tradition, there are signs, source signs. There's the passion narrative source. Then you have these theological discourse layers, a redactor, and a final editor adding chapter 21. See, all these layers. See, this is far removed from James' simple Jewish-rooted faith. Then we have the famous chapter 21, recognized as an addition. Nearly all scholars, both conservative and liberal, agree the gospel originally ended at chapter 20 in verses 30 and 31, and chapter 21 was added later. Now, you've only to read the end of chapter 20 to notice it is a conclusion. But then comes the end of chapter 21, which also ends the same way, as a conclusion. What does this mean? There is more than one author involved, more than one stage, more than one agenda, and that the beloved disciple tradition is being used really rhetorically. And also, why John's Gospel sounds so different from Jesus and James. See, the Gospel of John contains long mystical discourses, John chapters 12 right through to 17, theological debates, heavy emphasis on belief, almost no parables, and this metaphysical sort of language about pre-existence statements from Jesus that do not sound like the Jesus of the first three synoptic Gospels. So all of this reflects a sort of theological development, a community interpreting Jesus through Greek ideas, the lens of Greek ideas, not the original teachings of Jesus or indeed James. Yet the gospel, it still carries profound spiritual truth, as long as we recognize its nature. See, understanding this gospel's formation really helps us to see Jesus more clearly, to understand the diversity of early Christianity, to distinguish between Jesus, his own teachings, and the later theological sort of reflection, those layers which come down to us. Appreciating John's gospel really for what it is, well, it's a theological meditation on Jesus, built on an early eyewitness tradition. And if the beloved disciple was James, his testimony may lie behind some of its most powerful moments. But the gospel itself, especially its opening and later layers, well, they reflect a community trying to express Christ in the categories of its own times and culture, Greek and Roman culture. So, whether the beloved disciple was John or Lazarus or James, the heart of this gospel remains the same. John chapter 21 and verse 19, this addition. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And after he said this, he told him, "Follow me." And for those of us who seek to follow Jesus himself, understanding the voices behind this gospel's text helps us hear Jesus' voice more clearly. So, where do we go from here? Well, we have briefly held a comparison between James's letter and Paul's letter in the Last But One video. Would it not be good then to compare the teachings of the letter of James with the teachings of the individual gospel accounts and the book of Acts and see what we can learn. I think you will be somewhat surprised at what actually begins to surface. So from next week, we will look closely at comparisons between James and the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts. So until then, thank you very much and see you next time.